Hello, everybody. Welcome to the InduSoft webinar covering security and LDAP. My name is Scott Courtier. I'm Senior Technical Sales with InduSoft. I'm going to be your host today. Thank you for joining, everybody. Really appreciate it. Melinda, thank you for the AV check. Appreciate that. Again, I'd like to welcome everybody to this webinar. This is going to be what I think is a good webinar. I had a lot of good questions come in this morning on the morning one. Some logistics. Number one, on this type of webinar, I cannot hear you. So if you have questions, put those into the chat panel or the Q&A panel. I'll try to get to those during the presentation, but if not, at the end, there is a Q&A section, again, at the end. Also, we do record these webinars, post this up on the website, usually in a few days. It doesn't happen immediately. I have already had requests to, in addition to the webinar, to post the slide deck as well. We'll take care of that for you. Let's see. Also, we follow this up with a survey. 3 things in the survey. Of course, with a survey, let us know how we did today. Let us know if there's any other webinar topics that you'd like to hear about. That's where this one actually came from. We got several requests in our year-end survey to do a little bit more in-depth about LDAP. And if you didn't know, we actually have over 150 webinar recordings up on the website. So if you go to our website, here's the InduSoft.com homepage, and you go to Support Video Library Webinars, you're going to find that there's over 150 recordings logged here in chronological order, but then over here on the right-hand side, they're broken up into categories. So you can see that we've actually done several, 9 different webinars on security, either features of InduSoft or co-hosted with other guests. That's another part of the survey. Let us know if you're interested in co-hosting a webinar with us. We'd love to have you on and get real-world insight on how you've used InduSoft to solve your problems. So if you're an industry leader, let us know about that too. The other thing in the survey, give us your shirt size, and we will send you a free T-shirt just for joining us, show you our appreciation. So with that, let's go ahead and start to get in here. Again, if you have questions, put those into the chat panel or the Q&A panel, and I'll answer those. What am I going to cover? A real brief InduSoft overview. I recognize that many of you might be actually attending this webinar because your company is using InduSoft and you're in the IT group and you want to understand a little bit more about that end of it. Maybe you don't know anything about InduSoft, so I'm going to do a 2-slide overview on just what the heck the product is. And then we'll give a covering overview of the security system within InduSoft Web Studio from a high level, because we've already covered that, as you can see, in several other webinars and our training videos, things of that nature. But that's going to be more of a lead-in to talking about LDAP and Active Directory, and why are they, why do you need them, how do you use them, and configuration options. Okay, so before that, kind of a disclaimer. This presentation is not meant to supersede your corporate policies. Please take that under consideration. First of all, I am not a trained IT person. Certainly not trained in security policies, and I often will use the brute force method, like open up the firewall just to make things work as a test. You should definitely not follow me down those paths. This is for informational only. Please make sure you refer to your corporate documentation and work with your IT group if you're not already, to make sure that you're following your corporate security policies and good practices in general. And as you know, security is important. It's changing all of the time. There's new threats from everywhere, new things. If you haven't heard, there was a problem with the Intel microprocessors, and they found ways that based on predictive going and grabbing RAM locations, it could actually advantage of that and possibly get access to other information. So, wow, who would have thought that? So things are updating and changing all the time. really suggest that you stay on top of that. So again, this is not meant to supersede your corporate policies, but be more for information about configuring LDAP within InduSoft Web Studio. So again, real quick about the product. What is InduSoft Web Studio? As you can see here, it's an HMI or human machine interface / SCADA software. It's meant to run on personal computers, whether it be laptops, desktops, industrial panels on your manufacturing floor, on your machines, in a process. Could be embedded within your devices, could be mobile devices. Long-time InduSoft users will know that we've been running on Windows platforms, whether it be Windows CE and mobile, Windows Embedded, Windows Desktop, and even Windows Server editions since our inception 21 years ago. And within the last 3 or 4 years, we've actually been running on Linux and VxWorks, supporting the, depending on where you're at in the world, Industrial Internet of Things, Industry 4.0, China 2025. So lots of different variations on embedding this product, this runtime, into other devices, whether it's pumps, actuators, manifolds, things of that nature, and being able to collect data and get that information to a plant-based database or a cloud-based server of some sort, and understand that, turning that into information and being able to use that. So anyway, that is kind of the high level of what InduSoft Web Studio is. If you didn't know this, we tend to put all of the features into the product to give you the ability to create a SCADA system, an HMI system, or an Internet of Things solution. And all of those features tend to get installed once, the first time you install. We make it easy. We just put everything in there. And very, very few things do you have to license externally. We don't want you to have to go back and ask for more money, go back to purchasing and say, oh, I forgot to do this. We just kind of put everything in there, from the tags database, multiple language, remote management, thin client access, emails. You can see here, this is what we're going to cover today, the security system, communications. We've got over 250 drivers built in, if you didn't know. As of the version 8.1, now it's license unlimited for the number of drivers in the product, basically limited only by your hardware constraints. And so a lot of different features in the product, from the smallest tag count system to the largest tag count system. It's a very, very complete and comprehensive set of tools. So with that, let's talk about the security system in general. One of the things that I've noticed as I've taught training classes is that many people are either using competitive products that don't do this, or they just weren't aware that you can put security levels at the screen level on objects, such as the command animation to change screens, things of that nature, or even on task worksheets. Something that I want to point out, let me build through this a little bit. But if I go into a project here, and I've got a test LDAP project that I'm going to use. It's all configured and working with an LDAP server. I've created a screen here, and if I've just created a brand new screen, in fact, let me do that here. Let me. It's going to take a second here because of the security system through the network. If I right-click, insert, and I create a new screen, I get this security level here. And when you set up your access rights, you're going to set up levels for each of the groups. And we'll talk about that in a minute as well. But this is where you would set up security on an individual screen. It's going to take that level to get there. And one of the things that I like to bring up is setting up security at the screen level, as opposed to, for example, if you put a menu button on the screen and put a command animation on it, and you go in here and then you configure your security setting here. Rather than doing it on the button alone or the navigation menus, I suggest putting it on the screens. And the reason is if you or somebody else comes along and adds a different menu, somebody says, hey, I want a special button down here in the corner, and you add a button. You might forget to put that security at the button level, and you can do it both. You can do it on the button and on the screen, but if you do it on the screen, it's going to prevent somebody from getting into that screen that's not supposed to be there. Also, another thing that I want to point out, let me close this screen without saving here. On your task worksheets, for example, recipes, reports, trends, things of that nature, one of the things I didn't realize is there's actually the ability to put security on here. And in doing a little research for this, I found out that if you first open up one of these worksheets, whether it be trends, recipes, reports, etc., here in the security system, this access level is blocked until you actually click in the body of the worksheet, and then you can set the password level to get at this. So I didn't know that was there. Learned something new every day about this product. And if I didn't mention this, before I was an employee, I was actually a customer, and I've been using this product for close to 20 years. And yesterday I learned something new. Today I learned something new. Every day is like that. Pretty feature-rich product. So there's a couple of things, if you didn't know, putting access levels at the screen level on objects or even on task worksheets. And we're going to talk about the different security modes within InduSoft. When you first right-click on the security settings, so here under the global, actually there's several different places you can do this. You can do this from the project level and go through here. Or through the global tab here on the Project Explorer, you can get at security. If you right-click on security here, you can get at the settings. Now, the first time you do this, you get walked through this security system configuration wizard successive times after you do it. The first time, you don't go back through this wizard, although you can call it back up if you want to. These different security modes, there's actually 4 different security modes listed. I really call it kind of 1.5 or 2.5, I should say. And what do I mean by that? There's the local only security mode, which is the mode that we've had built into InduSoft Web Studio for years and years. You configure groups, you configure users, you set rights, and that's all self-contained in the project and maintained that way. Then a few years ago, customers asked us, hey, we want a better way to manage the security. So for example, if you were in a detention environment, a prison environment, and you had 10 InduSoft workstations all around the prison and one security guard leaves, if it was local only, you'd have to go around and manage the security on each of the 10 different workstations. Well, when we implemented, let me click on this, I like to think that the local only is similar to the distributed server and the distributed client. And what do I mean by that? Actually, the distributed server and the client are related. They kind of go hand in hand. In the scenario that I just gave you, maybe in a prison, you might have one workstation set up as the distributed security server and the remaining 9 workstations set up as distributed clients, where the clients will then authenticate and get their information from the workstation that's the server. All kinds of neat things happen. There's caching involved. If the server goes offline, the clients can then have their own local cache, so you can still continue to run. And then if you make changes locally, everything gets synchronized back up through the server to the remaining client. So lots of real good things happen there. But the distributed client and server you can almost think of as like an enhanced local only. And again, you would configure one server on the system, on the network, and then one or multiple clients reporting to that or authenticating against that server. That's kind of a quick and high-level overview of these first 3 modes, but we're going to spend a lot of time or the remaining time talking about LDAP for the remainder of this webinar. So this is kind of what I just described. This is copy and paste right out of the help. I want to make sure that I didn't miss anything. So the local only is kind of the standard mode for most projects, and again, it's kind of self-contained within that project folder. As I mentioned, the distributed server is similar to local only, except that this security system is made available to other projects that are set up as the clients. They're on the same network. Also, if the project loses a security system for some reason, it can re-import the configuration from one of its client projects. And what's really neat is this kind of goes through this whole synchronization thing, that if the server is offline, you make a change in the client, there's a way to get that back up into the server, and then from the server to the remaining clients. And then the cache, so that if you lose connection, can still continue to work. Now, separate from those is LDAP, and what does LDAP stand for? First of all, it's Lightweight Directory Access Protocol, and I'm going to describe that a little bit more in a minute. But it's really meant to work with LDAP compliant domain servers, such as Active Directory from Microsoft. It could be Open LDAP from Linux or other instances. But Microsoft Active Directory, and in Linux, I think they use Atom, and we'll talk briefly about that. But the way that this is set up is this is not stored in the local environment. You're talking about an Active Directory, a directory space that is not stored on the local computer. And so we'll talk a lot about that. So again, LDAP is Lightweight Directory Access Protocol, and Active Directory is a directory services database. And now you can think about this as almost similar to a database, and a way to talk to that being SQL. Well, this is very similar. Active Directory is your directory database, and LDAP is one of the protocols that you can use to talk to it. So once you understand that LDAP is the protocol and Active Directory is kind of like the database where the directories are actually stored, that becomes a little bit easier to understand. Now, in doing a little bit of research for this, first of all, I am in no way a security professional, and honestly don't know a whole lot about how all this LDAP works. But in doing a little research on this, I found that Active Directory actually has its roots in the telephone system. So in creating directories or telephone books, or how people's phone numbers used to be stored, is where they kind of came up with this idea, and how it all kind of ties together. Why? Why would you use this? So Active Directory is centrally managed, and why is that important? It's usually done at the corporate level, and it's done once by the IT department, not necessarily the controls engineers, which I would imagine many of you that are on this call are controls engineers configuring InduSoft systems and deploying those. And in this way, you don't have to create your own security system as you would if you were using the local or distributed security systems in InduSoft Web Studio. Basically, you're going to work with the IT department and get on the Active Directory and talk to that Active Directory and use that as a centrally managed system. It's going to save you some time, especially managing users down the road. So let's talk a little bit about Active Directory. Active Directory basically holds objects. So whether they're people or computers or printers or devices, you can think of those as objects, and they're viewed at a number of levels. And this breaks things down into the forest, the trees, and the domains. And kind of from a top-down standpoint, at the top you have the forest and trees. A set of trees make up a forest, and then below trees you have domains, and a set of domains make up the trees. Copy this image from Wikipedia, and if you take a look here, you've got the domain Atlanta, domain Dallas, make up the tree, the southern tree here, and domain Philly, New York, and Boston probably make, it's not shown here in this picture, but probably make up a tree something like northeast instead of southern here. And if we break apart this domain Dallas, expand that, you're going to find out there's this organizational unit for marketing, this organizational unit for sales. In this structure, it's kind of a fancy organizational unit. It's kind of a fancy way of calling it by a folder. But in here, you're going to have your objects, your devices, your people, your users, whether it's computers, printers, etc. So we're going to expand on this a little bit, but just so you understand this structure, within a large organization, you might have multiple domains, kind of as shown here. Even in a really large company, you might have multiple trees and usually only one forest, but often in extremely large companies, you might have several forests, depending on how that's all made up. But it's common for medium-sized and small companies to really only have one forest at that level. So I'm going to flip this diagram that I just did, or just how I talked about that, kind of flip that over so that domain is up here at the top. So we're going to talk about domains first. But when you deploy this, and this is copied right from Wikipedia, I'll admit that the objects for a single domain are stored in a single database. And that's kind of important to understand how they're stored. The domain, a domain is defined as a logical group of objects, which I kind of showed in that folder structure on the previous page. And they share the same Active Directory database. Now, at the tree level, it's a collection of one or more domains. And there's a hierarchy structure to this. And at the top of the structure is the forest. And really, that's kind of the absolute high-level things that you can drill down into. And it's not so common that you're going to probably deal at the forest level, but probably more likely at the domain level. Let's expand on the concept of authentication versus rights. Authentication is the process of verifying someone or something is who or what they say they are. And there's several different ways to do that. Most often within many systems, you're going to find a logon with a username and password. That's typically what we're going to do. There's often two-factor authentication where there's I think I got this right here. Something that you know, something that you are, or something that you, I might have this wrong, remember, but the basic idea is you can use a username and password. That's something that you know. Something that you are is like biometrics, where it's your fingerprint, an iris scan. Now on Android and Apple phones are doing face scans. And so that's one level. And another level is many of you will have used RSA security keys. RSA is a company or a product that will often send you a time-stamped number that times out, and you'll have to input that. They have these little credit card things that churn out numbers, or they'll text it to you on your trusted smartphone, things of that nature, or email it to you. And that's a two-factor authentication. And you're going to find that Google is doing that, and a lot of other online services. It's just a way to kind of lock things down a little bit tighter. So the authentication process, again, is just verifying that somebody is who they say they are. Now, when we talk about rights, especially within InduSoft Web Studio, it's the specific rights that a member of that group has when they use a project within InduSoft Web Studio to access the project during runtime. So, for example, if you set up a particular group, whether they're operators, maintenance staff, supervisors, engineers, however you want to break that down, we allow you to assign runtime access and engineering level access. So this is the development environment. So you could block a user from creating new projects or even modifying screens, modifying tags. And it's going to be pretty common that most people who log on are not going to have engineering access. You might uncheck all of these boxes depending on who your group is, let's say an operator group. And even at the group level, you might block operators from being able to do any of these accesses, whether it's start the project, close the project, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But maybe at the supervisor level, they can start the project if it gets stopped, but then shut off all this other stuff. So, and then even as you go higher, maybe to the engineering level, well, then you get the ability to stop the project, and make changes and things of that nature. So again, those are your rights. So there's a difference between authentication and rights, and that's kind of clear to necessary to get clear to really understand how to set this up. Now, based on the groups, when you set these different security levels, and this can be a range from 0 to 255, how does that get used? Well, back on one of the previous slides, I talked about the setting up the screen level security, the object level security, or even the task worksheets where you configure logging, trend logging, recipes, reports, etc. And that's where you would use those levels. So, for example, if this group, a user was a member of this group, when they were signed on, they only have access level from 0 to 50. And if you put this screen level at 51 or 100, let's say, then that user couldn't get into that screen as long as they weren't at those levels. Question came up in the morning webinar. Have we ever thought about configuring these with tags? And I thought about this, and I'm not even 100% sure that you can't put tags in there. I'm guessing that the question came in because they tried it. But even if you can't, there is a handful of built-in functions within InduSoft Web Studio to manage your security, set up new users, add, remove users. So through that set of built-in functions, you could actually add users and remove users and groups and things of that nature, and allow essentially modifying of these different security levels through that mechanism. So that's one way to do it. A little brute force, but a way to do it. All right, so this next slide, we start to talk about the actual LDAP configuration. So I'm going to show you how I get there. And if I come in here to my project and I go on global security, first of all, if I expand this, I can see my users and groups. But if I just right-click on security and go to settings, you'll see where, and again, I've already run the wizard once. If I wanted to, I could run that again. But since I came in here through the wizard and this project was set up ahead of time, it was chosen to be set up as LDAP. Now, if I click on server settings, what you're going to see here is this setup that I have, or a copy of this screenshot here in the PowerPoint. I'm just going to kind of walk through this in the PowerPoint and then do what I can in the actual project. So before we get there, I want to show you a screenshot of what Active Directory looks like. When I was setting up this webinar, I logged into one of our Active Directories. I did a remote desktop into it, took a screenshot. So this shows you what the Microsoft tools for managing that and adding that. So you can see here's the domain level. We called it QA domain, and then within that domain you can see the users and groups and then the names associated with that. Now you can drill into this even farther. You can right click on this and get into properties, and you can even configure custom setups for these if you need to. We'll talk a bit about that because that's going to be, for one feature, that is going to be required. So this is what the Active Directory administrative tools look like. But let's go back to that first kind of screenshot talking about these LDAP settings. So when we get on this first tab here, you're going to have to match this domain with the name of the domain that you're trying to access. And I go back to the slideshow and go up to that previous slide, that's going to have to match that domain. And I did notice that when I was setting this up that, and I'm not sure what the reason for this is or the protocol, but the domain is actually called QA-domain here. But if you notice that in our demo application that we're actually setting this up as QA-domain.com. And I think that has to do with the structure of the forest, the trees, and the domains. The .com is part of that. So if you're having trouble, maybe this is something that you need to add the .com at the end of that. Now, the LDAP server credentials is obviously, or I think it's obvious, I hope it's obvious, that in order to use this to actually get to the LDAP server or the Active Directory is you're going to need a user that has administrative rights on that server. And if your IT department will not give up an administrative level access rights, well then they're going to have to come and enter this password every time you configure a new project or every time you're trying to do that. That might be a pain, but that depends on your security policies and how you have that set up. Maybe they can set up an administrative account for you and let you get into that. One of the things, in addition to having administrative rights for that, a lot of people don't realize that you can actually put string tags in here. So in place of the user, in place of this password, you can use a string type tag inside of curly brackets in these fields. Now it gets a little strange when you're entering a password because it puts up those blocking characters in there, but it will handle that in both cases. Now this next section down here, the connection settings, this is have to do with the timeouts and the retry intervals. So for example, if you are connected to an LDAP server and for some reason after 10 seconds, or in this case the default is 10 seconds, whatever the time that you put in here, it no longer can communicate with that, well then it will give you a failure status, and we'll talk a little bit about these status tags here in a second. But if it is not able to connect and it actually goes into that timeout condition, well then it will use this retry interval for the time period that it waits before it retries. So that case, in this case, it will, if it's not able to communicate after 10 seconds or within 10 seconds, it will error out, and then it won't try again for, in this, the way this is configured, for every 2 minutes. So it doesn't keep banging on the server trying and trying and trying and trying. There's a retry interval where you make it a gentle retry as necessary. If this timeout scenario happens, and again we'll talk about the status tags in a second, then it's going to go into a cached mode. It tries to authenticate against the Active Directory, the LDAP server first, and if it can't, then it falls back into these cache settings. I'll get to those cache settings after I talk about this status tag. So in this scenario, we've put in a tag in here called security system or SS status. And one of the things I wanted to point out in the help system, and this is in the help system, and I actually copied the table regarding the error codes. You actually have these different error codes. Well, it's a little strange, but you need to know this, is 4, the value 4 in this status tag is actually the good connection. I'm not sure why they did that, but if you know our drivers, for example, and you have a status, a read status or a write status, it's very often that 0 is a good connection and a non-zero number, either positive or negative, is an error code. Well, this is a little outside of that norm for the security system. Good connection is 4, and I'm going to kind of black this out for a second and show you something that happened to me when I first started this project up this morning, and I wasn't logged into our corporate network. Here's what I saw. I saw in the bottom of the security system, so let me go through here, right down here in the bottom, and let this communicate. This status, it didn't show up as good. What happened was it came in and said domain mode LDAP server is unreachable, checking the credentials, timeout. So it actually timed out, and it gave me a status in that status tag of 1, which means bind timeout. And that's because it couldn't find the server because I wasn't on the VPN. I wasn't on our corporate network. Now, something that is kind of your friend or can be your friend is this check connection. So if you set all this up and hit this check connection button, you can see that I'm successfully connected to that LDAP server. That's really handy. So once I logged into the VPN, my status changed to good in that message, and then I was just monitoring that status tag over here in the database SPY, and I could see that it was a 4, and again, 4 means good communication. So that's something that you could put maybe along with the read status from your drivers, put the security system status maybe in a maintenance screen or up on a status level that shows up if you have problems or however you want to do that. But that's something that should probably be monitored, especially if you're in a real secure situation. So continuing on with this, I talked about the cache. The cache size will allow you to configure the number of users that you want to cache. And this is just going to depend on your security system, the number of users that you have. If you have a very active environment, maybe a machine that's really active with a certain number of users, maybe a lot of users, maybe it's a very popular thing, you might want to increase the number of users. Now this is a FIFO, a first in, first out. So in this case, it's going to be the last 3 users that were logged into that are going to be cached. And again, as I mentioned earlier, it's going to try to authenticate against the remote server, but if it can't, it's going to authenticate against these local cache. And you can set that up to expire a certain number of days. You can even put in a tag in this field for the hours until cache expiration. You can put a tag in here, and it will tell you how many hours before that expires, so you can do some planning or warning messages, things of that nature. Now, this little checkbox here is kind of unassuming, and many people don't know what this is. I certainly didn't before I started paying attention to this for this webinar and researching this. But this mixed mode cache is a really neat opportunity if you are using LDAP or plan to use LDAP and domain level security. But if you configure this mixed mode cache, the way this works is first you would configure the local mode security. So you'd go back into the development environment and you change this to the local mode up here. Every time I switch screens, it's doing its communication to the LDAP server. So give me just a second here. So you change this setup to the local mode setup and configure your local security system, and that would save the security system essentially in your project folder, and configure that, set that all up based on that mode, if you will, and then you would go back into the LDAP settings here and configure and actually use these settings. Well, if the LDAP scenario fails, and the cache isn't there or it's expired or whatever the case, it fails over back to the local security system. And that way you can minimize kind of a lockout condition so that you can still possibly get back into that security system. One of the things that I'd like to, actually 2 things, I'm going to kind of offshoot on that because I always suggest that before you configure a security system in your project, you make a backup of your project. When I teach training classes, before we do the security system and before we configure multiple languages, I highly recommend people back up their project, because with multiple languages and with security system, I've seen people either change their language and you can't get back, or lock themselves out of the security system, and it's always a good idea to make a backup before you do that. So that's item number 1. Let's see. Oh, the other thing that I wanted to point out, let me get out of this menu here, is when you first get an application from somebody, let's say you're working with a coworker, or maybe you inherited a project from somebody else. One of the things that I often do when I get a brand new project is I will first open up the project, and before I run it, I know it's tempting to run it right away, but before I run it, I'll come in here to the settings. I'll go into the global tab, right-click here on security settings, and one of the first things that I'll do is just come into this menu and uncheck this checkbox that says Enable Security System. I had a real big problem on a Friday night. I had somebody send me a project. Hey, Scott, can you take a look at this? I opened it up, I ran it, and I was in the middle of editing some pretty huge documents, and I couldn't get out of it. I called the person back. They were gone for the day. I had to call their manager at home to get them to call the person to then give me the password so I can get back in so I didn't lose all my work. So a good thing is if you're inheriting a project from somebody or you don't know your passwords, come in here, disable the security system before you run it, and that'll give you a way to get around some of those things. Another kind of spin-off of that is if you've inherited a project from somebody, it's not really security system related, but just a good practice. If you've inherited a project from somebody and maybe you go into the screens folder and you've got hundreds or thousands of screens and you really have no idea where to start, what starts up? One of the things you can do is come in here to the viewer and look at this startup screen, and there will be the startup screen or the screen group that is your first screen that starts up. So again, just kind of a best practices or understanding how that works. Sometimes good to know, especially if you inherit a project from somebody else. So back in here into security, and I'll go back into the PowerPoint while that's kind of loaded up there. We'll go into the security settings. Back into the PowerPoint, and that we covered mixed mode in there. Now, if we go over to the next tab, and we're going to talk about the advanced settings. So this first section is your your server address manual configuration. A couple things that's necessary to understand here. If the LDAP server is on the same domain as the InduSoft workstation or the computer that it's running on, then you don't need to set up a server IP address in here. It'll be able to figure that out based on, let's say, domain name. If for some reason by using the domain name you can't get at it, then it may be necessary to manually put in an IP address in here. Now, this by default uses port 389. If your network environment, your switches, your routers are not set up to have port 389 open, you might want to discuss with your IT group that you're going to need port 389. I always find it's really handy to work when you're working with an IT group. Tell them what you need and why you need it. In this case, you're going to have to make sure that they open up port 389. Earlier this year, I did a project where we had to work with an IT group, and they were taking everything that we said literally, and we said, okay, can you get us open up this IP address? They did that, but they kept off some of these ports closed, and we weren't able to gain access through their managed switches. Another opportunity is that will support secure sockets, HTTPS type connection. So if you need that, then you would check this checkbox and then note that port would change from instead of 389 to 636. This little checkbox here is something that we added for a handful of special customers that wanted to use a directory services on a Linux-based system. So instead of using a Microsoft Active Directory, this allowed us to connect to that Atom type system. And something to note, and this is listed in the help system, when you use the Atom system, the simple bind, the credentials are sent in plain text or clear text. So you really should make sure that you secure that connection with either a VPN, TLS, or SSL type connection or proxy, and that'll prevent that clear text from being exposed as it goes through the wire. This whole section here, this save rights to server. If I go back into InduSoft and we go back into the section where we're configuring groups. Remember, I defined the difference between authentication and rights. So if I go here under the groups, and again, I'm going to wait for this to actually connect. I don't know if you guys can see this, but I have a little spinning wheel here on the my development environment. So if I go here back under security, it's not letting me click. It's communicating in the background, making sure, again, I'm who I say I am. I think I have some screens here. So if I go back up through these slides, I'll be able to talk about this. So here under this rights section, where based on a group you configure the rights, these rights are actually stored in your project. So when you configure the rights within InduSoft Web Studio, those rights are stored in the security part of your project. But if you want to, you can click on Modify here. That'll prompt you for access administrative security, and enable this. And then this will allow you to then, even though they're normally stored locally, you can set up the server so that you can send those rights, all those different checkboxes under those group settings, to be stored in the LDAP server in your Active Directory, so that they're not stored locally, but they're stored based on a user or an object level. One of the things that's necessary to understand is at that level then, up on the LDAP server, the Active Directory, you're going to need to create custom attributes for those particular users or groups, I should say, to be able to store those rights as parameters as part of those groups. So there is going to be a little bit of customization that you need to do that, but then again, as I mentioned earlier, that will be then centrally stored and centrally managed, and that'll be able to help you out down the long run, especially the fact that you can copy users and domains and things of that nature and be able to modify them that way. There's a question that came in. Let me see if I can answer that now. So verify users. So I'm not sure I understand the question. I'm going to try to read this a little bit. They're using InduSoft Web Studio as a cloud service, and the clients connect through WebThin Client. Now, WebThin Client is, if you're not familiar with that WebThin Client will be the one using Internet Explorer, and they're using IWS to create users. So they're using the scripting language to be able to create users. If you are using the local security system with that, you'd be able to create users within the project. If your question is, can you use LDAP instead of the built-in security? I believe the answer is yes. Yeah. Now, as long as through your cloud-based service you have access to an LDAP server and Active Directory via network, as long as you have some type of access there, then yeah. And the question is it best or is it better? Well, that's up to you on what fits your needs and your customers' needs. The fact that it's centrally located and you manage it in one spot might be a worthwhile investment in time to be able to do that. Hopefully that answers your question there. So again, while I'm thinking about it, if you have questions, put those into the chat panel or the Q&A panel. Compliment coming back. Thanks. You're welcome. Okay, moving on. The next setup here is the LDAP query customization. And before you use this, one of the things you're going to find is it almost looks like it's entirely grayed out. So if I walk through these steps here and I go to the LDAP query customization, it looks like it's all grayed out. And at first thought, I was like, hey, I can't use this. Maybe it's broken, or maybe it's because the project's not running. Nope, that wasn't it. Well, here's the deal. First, you have to go in to tell it you want to modify this, and then you have to prove you are who you say you are. So I'm going to enter my password in here, and let's see if I can do this. And if I've entered the right password, this will come alive. Now, the first time you come in here, this checkbox will not be checked. You have to check that checkbox, and then you can start to use this. Now, there's all different kinds of filtering capabilities in here, depending on what pieces and parts that you want to use. But really what this is, and let me go back to the PowerPoint because this really says this. By default, the LDAP server provides a list of all registered users and groups. Well, if you're in a large company, this could be a huge list, literally in the thousands or possible millions of objects. And you have to remember that it's not just users. It could be down to the level of printers, computers, devices on the network that could be managed through Active Directory. So you possibly could have thousands or even millions of objects in there. And that might take a long time to get to. And this provides you a way to better filter or isolate users out of this. So let me give you an example. If in your process or your machine, your plant floor, there's no way ever that the administrative assistant or office workers are ever going to come out to the plant floor and log into one of your computers, well, you might want to filter those out of the equation and not allow them to log on to the HMI that's running the machine. So in this way, you might want to add the operator groups, the supervisor, control supervisor, maintenance staff, production, whatever makes sense. Enable those groups. Now, something interesting is this syntax. First of all, they are case sensitive, so you have to pay attention to that. And the syntax is a little strange. You put the operator at first, and then the rest of it. So there's a really good example out here on the good Microsoft TechNet article. And if I launch that, let me find my web browser over here, bring that into play here. You're going to find there's a whole article on LDAP query basics, and it shows you how to build queries based on, for example, a name, a group, and say, okay, I can say it's this and that, but not this. And this will allow you to filter out based on domains, based on users, groups, things of that nature. So I wanted to point that out. That, again, is going to be included. This slide deck will be included when we post the recording of this webinar. Again, just a reminder, because we're coming close to the end, if you have questions, put those into the chat panel or the Q&A panel. So once I come in here and I've logged in, I think I did this in front of you, then I'm able to get in here. Don't forget to check the checkbox, and then you're going to be able to build in your filter query in there. So that covers really all the different topics from this setup. Talked about authentication, talked about rights, talked about Active Directory. So I want to open that up to questions, if there's any questions. Right now there's no questions, so put those in. One of the questions that came in is, do we support single sign-on? And that was in the morning webinar, and what they were referring to is if a user has to, let's say they boot up the computer and they have to log into Windows, when they start the InduSoft application, if it's set up for LDAP, are they going to then have to log into the InduSoft application? And the answer is yes. Just for, because we need to pay attention to who is who. And one of the things, if I go back on where I created that screen, I don't remember if I saved that. I probably didn't. But if I create a screen real quick and put a button on there, one of the features that we support in the security system is add a button here and command animation. One of the features that we support on the command animation and several other places is this idea of e-signature. And the idea of e-signature is, for example, if a supervisor logs into a secured screen, does their thing, and then walks away and leaves it signed in, there's a way you can set up a certain amount of timeout or that it will challenge the next user to make sure that who they say they are. So the operator can't run up as soon as the supervisor leaves and say, oh, I want to play with what the menu that they got into. If you set that e-signature timeout to 0, it's going to challenge them every single time they try to use that function that has the checkbox for e-signature on it as well. Question came in, can I demonstrate how to customize the query? I wish I could. I've never actually used that feature. That's why I pointed out that article. If there's something that you'd like that you don't know how to do, either feel free to get a hold of our support group or I've kind of logged who you are. If you want me to see if I can send you kind of a customized query, I will try to do that after the webinar, because I'm curious about that myself, but I've actually never set that up. I would really like to be able to do that for you live, but apologize that I can't do that. So yeah, one of the things that I'd like to see is allow a group or multiple groups access. So for example, an operator group and a supervisor group. How do I build that query? So okay, yep, you're welcome. I will definitely follow up with you. So Any other questions? There are no other questions in the queue right now. With that, I'm going to leave up a screen here that if you need help with security or having some trouble, let us know. From a commercial standpoint, you can send us an email at info@indusoft.com. If you've got licensing questions, salesy questions, let us know. If you need help, maybe you're having trouble like this person was asking about how do you customize a query, support@indusoft.com is a good place to send that. You can always call us. If you're ever logged into the website, let's see what I do with my browser. It's over here. If you're ever logged into the website, the InduSoft website here on the home page, if you didn't know this, we've actually got a nice little box up here that you can do an online chat. And maybe if it's something that's not immediate and you'd like to run this by other users or even share this with other users, this forum here is a really good place to have user-to-user help. Sometimes the InduSoft team chimes in here. I'm guilty of that myself. But this is really kind of a user-to-user. And we've got some, I really have to give kudos to a couple of our customers because I think they log in every day and help out other customers, and that's really very interesting and very, very helpful. And they often are very, very helpful and very, very knowledgeable. So if you've got something that maybe is not time dependent, or if you want to share, put it in the forum. We'd appreciate that. Other users would appreciate that. So the question is, how is another question came in, how is an LDAP user assigned a security level? Well, that's the difference between the authentication. It's actually not done at the user level. A user is actually part of a group. And then, so for example, I'm authenticating against or working with the groups. Now, these are actually up at the Active Directory server. We communicate to that via LDAP. And then once we set up those users, if we were to look at these different users, if I go into the properties, I'm sorry, not at the users, but at the group level, this is where their different security levels are set up right here. So again, that's at the group level, and then users would be part of those different groups. So I hope that answers that question for you. Let's see, I don't see any more questions coming in. So I'm going to leave this up here with, if you need to get a hold of us, please do. And okay, thanks. I hope that answered your question. There was a thank you that came in. I'd like to thank everybody for attending today. That's it for today's webinar. Again, don't forget to fill out the survey. Let us know how we did today. Let us know your shirt size. We'll send you a free t-shirt, show you our appreciation. Also, let us know if you would ever like to co-host a webinar with us. We'd love to have you on. And with that, we're going to end the webinar. And thanks for attending, and everybody have a great day.